Hello, everybody. Welcome. We have a little interesting balance outside. There's a sort of anti-pleasure presentation being given. I don't know if everybody's noticed that. But it will give a certain piquancy to our discussion today to know that there's other views. Very glad to see everybody. I'm Elizabeth Gregory. I'm the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today to the first in this semester's Barbara Carkeby Living Archive series, which is sponsored by the Friends of Women's Studies. The series features interviews with women from the Houston area on wide range of topics of interest to women and their experience. These are videotaped and collected in the Carrie C. Short Women's Archive and Research Center here in the library. And if you haven't taken a tour, there are tours available after this talk. Since you're already here, you might as well go. It's very interesting. And if you yourself have papers, or the focus of the archive is on the papers of Houston area women's organizations. So if you belong to such an organization and you think that their papers should be collected in the archive so that they'll be available for students and scholars to do research on for the decades to come, please talk to Vince Lee, who's the librarian here, the archivist, or to any of the members of the Friends of Women's Studies. The mission of the Friends is to support the University of Houston's Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, research, teaching, and campus and community activities. And as you may know, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program offers an undergraduate major in WGSS leading to a BA and 2 undergraduate minors and a graduate certificate, which is like a graduate minor. Double majoring is also an option. That's a new feature this year. So we just graduated our first major in December. Yay! Yay. So please be in touch. We have a lot of upcoming events, including on February 2nd, a reading we're co-sponsoring with Gulf Coast by National Book Award winner Robin Cost-Lewis. February 4th, we're sponsoring a program called Electric Santeria, Racial and Sexual Assemblages of Transnational Religion. February 9th, Simmer on Spirit, a film screening and panel discussion. February 10th, our open house over in Agnes Arnold. And February 17th, Samina Ali, Muslim Women and Digital Activism, is part of the Issues in Feminist Research class, and she'll be giving a public talk as well. Then on February 23rd is the next Living Archives called Ending Sexual Assault, How Do We Get There? So lots to do in February if you keep coming back to this room. It's a nice room. Let me just hurry up and introduce today's panel. And let me note that today's topic, women and pleasure, could take us in a lot of different directions. So we're not going to cover the waterfront here. But women, like men, are wired for pleasure of many kinds. Some kinds of pleasures have been more available to different people in different social and historical positions more than others. The particular topic of women's sexual pleasure has long been a forbidden topic, as we heard from the speaker outside, due in some measure to a mood that wanted to discourage women from having sex. At least one reason for the old equation of chastity with respectability had to do with the production of children. So morality was one means of keeping kids from being born who either didn't have a framework for being supported or who weren't the genetic relatives of the woman's husband. So also many women learned the hard way that a few minutes pleasure could lead to a lot of children and a lot of attendant difficulties. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, birth control has radically changed both men's and women's experience of consensual sex, and our moral systems are still playing catch up. But I'll leave that, many other parts of this big topic, to our panel, and I refer you to your handouts for bios, and I'll just briefly introduce Emily deAyala, who is the president and clinical director of Houston Sex Therapy. Next to her, Josie Pickens, cultural critic, writer for Ebony magazine and instructor at Texas Southern. Next to her, Y.E.Torres, dancer, performance artist, and visual artist. And at the end of the table, Sheila Katz, who's an assistant professor of sociology here at U of H. And our moderator today is Sarah Luna, who's a postdoctoral fellow in women's gender and sexuality studies. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. So women in pleasure is a really big topic, and we all have various ways of approaching this, some more academic, some more hands-on. So I was wondering if you all could start talking briefly about how you approach pleasure in your work and in your life. And what you think are some of the most relevant issues and obstacles, as well as opportunities in thinking about pleasures of different kinds.
So I work as a certified sex therapist. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, but focus mostly on sex and relationship issues. So the people who come in to see me most often are presenting with a sexual complaint, and usually that's defined as an interruption in pleasure in some way, shape, or form. And what I do is a pretty thorough history and assessment to see if I can pinpoint what may be one of the underlying causes to the interruption in their pleasure. And that may be anything from, lack of sex education to history of sexual abuse, relationship issues, anxiety, trauma, body image, and the list goes on and on and on. So I really dig deep to see what I think may be a block to their pleasure and then focus the therapy on that. And so in terms of how I approach it, it's kind of peeling back the layers to the onion and seeing what is really the root cause of their issue, which can be very different for everyone who comes in.
Oh, that was great.
Thank you.
It's hard to follow. Well, I write a lot about love and relationships actually for Ebony magazine and speak a lot about women and pleasure and love and all of these things through a particular, is this too close? Hello? Okay. And I speak through a particular lens and talking about Black women and how they experience love and romance and pleasure. Specifically when focusing on pleasure, there's this sort of historical context that, we have to view Black women's sexual pleasure and pleasure at all through. As was mentioned earlier, this idea about respectability and chastity, well, that was something that was not allowed for Black women when they were enslaved. There wasn't a choice. There wasn't the availability of chastity or the ability to say no. And so that really shapes the way that Black women have grown even, post-slavery and even today in dealing with these ideas of respectability and kind of chasing this idea of chastity and respectability that kind of was never a space made for them in the first place for. So it's very dynamic to have that conversation with women, Black women, over and over when talking about pleasure. So there's lots to unpack before those women can even begin to think about what they want to do with their bodies, because we are still having conversations about ownership of our bodies.
Pleasure to me is a really personal thing because of the fact that I directly use my body to make a living. And so as a dancer, educator, and also as a submissive, I feel that I address pleasure in how I use my body to give my viewer, my audience, a vision of pleasure, whatever that means, whether I'm doing a fire show, whether I'm doing a burlesque show, or whether I'm belly dancing. And the history of my dance form also addresses the fact that we, at a point in our lives, were not allowed to show much of our body, and that at the end of the 1800s, there was an ethnic exhibit of showing women, dark-skinned women, scantily clad and gyrating their bodies in a way that the American culture thought was scandalous, which I love. And so as an educator, And as a dance instructor and as an art instructor, I feel that I show and provide humans pleasure, whether I'm teaching little ones how to look at art and see something beautiful for the first time and have a emotional reaction to that, as well as teaching women how to use their bodies in a way that allows them to be sexy because they were never shown, allowed, or even know how to connect to that part of their body. And as a submissive, I feel that both in performance as well as in my own personal practice, that going through the pain that you get from being in a BDSM experience, it is directly tied to the spectrum of pain and pleasure. So I feel that everything I do is full-time, and overall that I'm directly using my body to provide you, as well as myself, pleasure.
So I'm a sociologist, and I think about women in pleasure from a sociological frame, from a sociological lens. And I think about, I teach sociology of gender, both at the undergrad level and the graduate level. My areas of research are with low-income women and domestic violence survivors primarily. And so I think about pleasure within sort of our frame of patriarchy and our thoughts around the sexual double standard, and that whose pleasure has been the focus of sexual pleasure for, decades and for centuries. And so thinking through sort of modern women's pleasure and thinking about how feminism and how understanding sociologically whose pleasure whose pleasure that we hold to the standard, and then thinking how women can have agency and how women can claim their own pleasure, and how we can flip the scripts and how we can challenge patriarchal standards of beauty and pleasure and sexuality. Some of my work, I do qualitative longitudinal work with incredibly low-income women. About 80% of the women in my research are domestic violence survivors. And so when I talk to them about joy and pleasure in their lives, they're not talking about sexual pleasure sometimes. So I'm the one on the panel that's going to be talking about how pleasure, how your lived experiences can sometimes, in different places in your life, how you think about pleasure differently. And so these are women who have left incredibly abusive relationships, and the pleasure that they find in their lives is control over their own life and control over their own space and safety, and then reclaiming everyday pleasures like spending time with your children or going to the park or taking ownership of your body again and starting to maybe work out, but also, like Emily was talking about, finding mental health professionals to help you start working through some of the trauma that you've experienced. So I do this from a couple of different lenses. The last piece of this is I'm very active in reproductive justice work. I do both research in the area of reproductive justice and how reproductive justice issues are a poverty issue, and I've been doing some expert witness work on some of the state-level abortion trials. So I didn't work on the Texas case, but many of you maybe have heard earlier this week that there was a positive ruling in the Louisiana case. And so when we think about issues of reproductive justice, we need to be thinking about who's trying to control what and why. And so I do work in terms of, if we're going to talk about women's pleasure, we also need to talk about access to sex education. We need to talk about access to contraception. We need to talk about access to abortion.
Great, thank you all. The next couple of questions, you've all touched upon some of these a little bit, but since they're really important topics, I want to just ask it again in case any of you have anything to say about these. So I was wondering in what way the different following factors have affected pleasure in the way you've seen it in your work and life. So women's historical economic dependency upon men, also factors like white supremacy, wealth inequalities, and respectability politics. So you've all touched on all of those to some extent, but if you have anything else to say.
I think one thing I would add to that is I think we're living in kind of an interesting time, especially here in the United States, in the sense that women are depending less and less on men for economic support, and men have less of an interest in the paternity of their children in terms of they, can easily do a paternity test and know whether or not the child that they're supporting is theirs. And so I think some of the reasons that men and women initially got together as a dyad and kind of the socioeconomic arrangement has in in many ways started to break down, again, especially here in the United States, so I do want to make that distinction. That being said, I think that, both men and women are still making choices to get married for reasons that fit into some of the original historic motivations for marriage. And so there's just kind of an interesting dynamic, I think, to look out there in terms of how socioeconomics plays into pleasure for both men and women in relationships, if that makes sense.
Exactly. I don't necessarily, when speaking about Black women and pleasure, the economic issues kind of in like ideas about traditional marriage don't necessarily take up much space in that conversation, I think, as much as my research shows. I think the conversation with Black women really kind of surrounds these ideas of respectability and how that respectability, speaking of like white supremacy and this idea of humanity and being recognized as a human being, how does our ability, the politics of pleasure, how does our ability to speak about pleasure and our conversations about desire flow around this other conversation about like our humanity? And I think when I think about it on a personal level and the conversations that I have with my friends who are also doing this type of work academically and as cultural critics, I have this theory that I work on called the whole tape, right? And so it's this idea that for my friends and I, when we talk about pleasure and our desire to seek pleasure, have conversations about pleasure with those that we choose to receive pleasure from and give pleasure to, there's this whole tape, this horror tape that plays in our head every time that we think about like hooking up with somebody after a party or doing any of the things that our parents or the people in our community kind of say is a no, because again, when you operate outside of these walls of respectability, it really can turn into a conversation about your humanity. Think about the Daniel Holtzclaw case, for example. 13 Black women came forward, and I'm sure there were more in Oklahoma, who had this police officer sexually assault them, sometimes repeatedly. All of those women were poor, all of them were Black, all of them were from an impoverished community. Most of them were addicts or recovering addicts. Most of them, or some of them, were also sex workers. And so when we have these conversations about pleasure and respectability, and how it kind of links to white supremacy is really shown specifically in that case of Holtzclaw, because when there's an interview that's circulating with most of the women who came forward that I think was done through BuzzFeed, and listening to these women talk, you could see that they felt like their humanity was challenged in even coming forward about what had happened to them. They didn't feel like they had a space to complain about or to accuse this police officer of what he had done to them, this abuse of power that they were subjected to. A lot of them said, well, I'm ashamed because, I didn't want to embarrass my family, or I didn't want to embarrass my mother, or, I have this past and I didn't feel like anybody would believe me. This whole tape that plays over and over in our heads, even when we're abused. And so that, for me, this kind of intersection of how pleasure and respectability and racism and white supremacy and class, all of those things kind of come together, specifically in that case, but in a wider lens when we have these everyday conversations.
I remember that a couple years ago there was a scandal in the Houston belly dance community that was belly dancers attacking other belly dancers. And a belly dancer was accused of being a stripper. I was the only person that didn't care that she was also probably a stripper. I kind of wanted her to be a stripper. And so that makes me, I just remember thinking that, one, you have a community of women and men, but mostly women, attacking each other for using their body in a different way to show off and make money. And I constantly think about, like, how did we learn that and why do we agree with it? And so when I think about pleasure and respectability, I am reminded that I often get hate mail from my mother for modeling nude, even though I've been doing it for 20 years. And that even though I'm an adult, that even the stigma that women or humans in general using their bodies in a way that provides pleasure to themselves, or rather sexual pleasure blatantly to themselves, is not allowed. So again, when I think of pleasure and respectability, I think about what did we learn? How did we learn these things? What are the what are the roots of what we are taught is evil? And how brave those of us have to be to not only rise above the shame that we get from our families, but people in our own community. In terms of thinking about how one's income level or economics or whatever can affect you, I think that there's opportunities for us to all be very proud of what we do in terms of pursuing our own pleasure. Again, thinking that pleasure can be sexual, but can also be just simply appreciating and having joy for each other. I also think about the fact that looking at other sexual orientations as well as looking at other relationship types and how relationships among each other, both as friends or falling in love with more than one person or having multiple partners or being in love with multiple genders, can also create a lot of shame and rejection of pleasure and respectability. And so I kind of look at, not kind of, but I do look at all of these things, and even though I'm on this panel thinking about women and pleasure, I really do think about humanity and pleasure, because even though we're women and we're talking about how we give, receive, and experience pleasure, I identify as a pansexual woman and I'm polyamorous. So to me, I think about the fact that pleasure is really just about giving more love across the board to people. And I think if we, and in my own work, obviously, I like to address everything that way. Thank you very much.
So I think about pleasure and respectability and also shame and stigma. The women that I do research with and that I work with, both in my interviews, but also my research, incredibly low-income women, domestic violence, but they're also grassroots activists. They're also trying to change the welfare policy. They're trying to change the domestic violence policy. They're trying to change access to community services and things like that. And so women coming together and talking about issues of shame and stigma and talking about issues that that they've experienced abuse, or that they've experienced abuse with an intimate partner, they've experienced childhood sexual abuse, they've experienced abuse in the workplace, they've experienced abuse from a welfare worker, but being able to build that community and talk about how shame and stigma affects them individually, but for them to understand that it's not just an individual feeling, but that they're all experiencing it, and then being able to have the power to push back against it, I think connects to ideas of pleasure, because it takes, you have to, in big ways or little ways, stop feeling ashamed of who you are and your experience in order to say, you know, my life and my lived experience is something that I have survived, and I deserve pleasure, sexual pleasure, everyday pleasures. I deserve to have a healthy life. And so in the grassroots activism and in sort of the organization that I've been working with for many years was built very much on the 70s, feminist empowerment group sort of model. And then as the group, as people moved on in their lives and got jobs and their kids got older, they started connecting online, and so this is right as Facebook was taking off, and so the role of social media, and I'm fairly active on Facebook, and it was one of those weird things because I knew the women, they knew I was a researcher from the beginning, and that I was, a graduate student in sociology, but I hung out with them and was in the community for 11 years, that they started friending me on Facebook, and so you have, as an academic that moment, you have to make some decisions, but it's been interesting to watch them support each other on Facebook and to go through the process of building healthier lives and now starting to build healthier relationships. And also, Facebook's not as much a place that you talk about sexual pleasure, but you can tell that women are centering their priorities and pleasure broadly conceived in their lives in more important ways. And so to me, that's interesting, and I think that as a sociologist, thinking about ways that we can think about pleasure for other low-income communities or for domestic violence survivors or people who have been through other types of abuse.
Thank you. And kind of going off of that, can we, since we've talked about a lot of the kinds of different obstacles to different kinds of women's pleasure, do you all have any other kinds of examples of movements or practices that people have engaged in to create kind of communities centered around pleasure or practices centered around pleasure, to have other ways of thinking about pleasure?
I think it's really just important to talk about pleasure. I think doing something like this and getting these messages out into the community so that these ideas can spread is key. To touch on your point, Sheila, I think a lot of the work that I do is about reducing the shame that a lot of people feel, women especially, about experiencing pleasure. And if you think of children around the globe, children are not naturally shameful. Shame is a feeling that is imposed on them. Children are naturally curious, they're naturally vulnerable, they're naturally risk-taking. They're naturally all of these qualities that I believe are very important to fully experience pleasure. And so a lot of the work I do is in removing things like shame or anxiety or stigma that other people or cultures or even partners put on them. One thing I always like to remind women is that they have a body part that men don't have, whose sole purpose is sexual pleasure. It serves no other function. How many of you know what it is? It's the clitoris, for those of you who don't know. So it doesn't serve a reproductive function, it doesn't serve any other function except for sexual pleasure, so it must be there for a reason. So what I try to do is coach people on honoring what their bodies are able to do and to really enjoy what is naturally within. Qualities that I think get covered up over time for different reasons.
And I think the conversation of shame, shaming it as a mechanism of trying to provide safety is something that is a particular issue in the Black community. Just recently, last week, there was a woman, Janice Talton Jackson, who was essentially followed out of a bar and killed because she dismissed the advances of a man who was trying to come on to her. And so this idea of like street harassment is really a big issue in my community. And I wrote an article about Janice and talked about growing up and my developing body and how I was really ashamed of my body, and my mother made me feel ashamed of my body, and it was in an effort to ask me to cover up and to not be so expressive about what I was learning about my body and how I was feeling about my body, in an effort to keep me safe in some way. In a community where, as a small child, a 12-year-old, grown men were making advances towards me, sexual advances towards me, before I even knew what any of that meant. And so this is an experience that I've found through my research and through my conversations with Black women there's a long history of that also is kind of a residual of slavery and post-slavery, this idea of protecting one's body as best you can, and the best way to do that is to cover up as much as possible and to make yourself the least available as possible. And so when I came into my womanhood and came into feminism and really began to understand that I didn't have to be ashamed of my body or what it needed, the greatest thing that I think that has happened in relinquishing shame and abolishing and pushing shame away is social media, actually. And, you know, through social media, women sharing all kinds of stories about themselves. I know for myself, being able to flirt and tease and post pictures on Instagram and all of these little things that we take for granted and don't think mean a whole lot, really, I think, is becoming a mechanism for women to relinquish that shame and kind of, and also through the efforts of feminism, go for the things that they desire, which include a lot of things, but also includes their pleasure. I remember reading an article very recently, and I think it was in the New York Times, that talked about Tinder, like the Tinder app, and how it was the end of relationships and dating. And what really happens with these types of dating apps and hookup apps is it's giving women an opportunity to center their pleasure and make decisions about what they want and when they want it. And because of that, because this is something that men have been always have been able to do, and they haven't needed social apps, you know, social media in order to do it. But now that women are moving this way in social media spaces and getting on Tinder or these other hookup sites to center their pleasure and say, listen, I want sex and I want it now, pretty quickly. And I'm not going to apologize about that, and I'm going to be very straightforward about that. So now it's like the end of love and romance, and it's like, wait a minute. So really it's just about women having power over their desire and being able to speak that desire and use that language that is really frustrating all of these writers. It isn't about love or romance. It's just about women having access in a way that men have always had access, and the problem that creates, if that makes sense.
I love thinking about the idea of communities and pleasure, centered around pleasure. I have been teaching dance and movement since about 2008. And one of the things that I loved about taking classes was simply being in a space that I was able to move my body and learn new ways of utilizing my body. And I found over the years of teaching various movement types, from yoga and belly dance to hoop dance, that there was a lot of people who held fear around coming to my classes or coming to classes in general due to their own shaming of their body. And I personally developed a class that I just called Sexy Movement, or Sexy Movement in Yoga, that gave people the opportunity to give permission to themselves to do everything from moving their body in sinuous serpentine ways, or gyrating their hips in a way that for some reason, you know, in their own history, they felt was not good for them, or that they were unable to do. And from doing that, I started to have students that had sometimes physical disabilities or mental disabilities that would work one-on-one with me just to have that opportunity. So to create that community with me, as well as with, you know, with the bigger group of movement artists, has been really great. There's one particular movement retreat that I participate in called Hottie Hoop Camp, and I think that particular event is such a fantastic example of communities and pleasure, or a community created around giving pleasure. This particular retreat is a flow arts or hoop dance-based retreat, but alongside the movement, they also give women the opportunities, because it's a women's retreat, opportunities to learn about the health at every size movement. So you have people of all ages and of all body types moving together and doing costuming together and doing makeup tricks, and basically getting to be around a community of of other women where they can sometimes for the first time not feel judged. Additionally, as a fire performer, having an element of nature that I'm learning to manipulate to perform with has been very interesting because the community around that is all about pleasure and pleasure with fire. And so that particular community has been exquisite to be around, one, because it's an extension of a circus arts community, but also because you'll never see someone as happy as they are when they eat fire for the first time and doing it in front of people, or taking fire and running it across their hand, across their body. Like the amount of pleasure that it gives you. I mean, it scares my mother, but the amount of pleasure it gives you is amazing. And then imagine someone who's brave enough later to perform that in front of other people. That is such an interesting high. Lastly, I find that one of the more maybe interesting, I'll say, communities that I am involved with that is centered around pleasure is the BDSM world. There are parties that we call play parties. They're just based on pleasure. And that pleasure is consent-based. So imagine what that's like. And again, this is my work. You can come see me on Saturday perform this stuff, you know? So yeah, the idea of communities based around pleasure, I mean, those 4 examples are completely different, but they're all based around women and humans providing themselves and each other pleasure.
Okay, so one of the ways in thinking about community and also thinking about overcoming trauma and things like that, one of the interesting sort of turns in my life in the last year and a half or so is that I have found a community online of other feminist academics who are working to overcome major traumas in their life and to are dating again for the first time maybe in many years and are centering their own pleasure. And so in addition to being an academic and teaching about sociology of gender and thinking about these issues of sexuality and gender dynamics and gender inequality and poverty, I also went through a fairly traumatic and then brutal divorce and had to step away from a relationship that was a very, very long marriage for as young as I am, and then rebuild my life in a strange city where I don't know anybody. And so in doing that, I had to reach out in ways to a community of people there were 3 other feminist academics who also had recently taken tenure-track jobs in cities where they didn't know anybody and had experienced different but similar traumas. And so we have figured out how to be a support network for one another online, and then we meet at conferences and really talk about feminist dating or, oh my God, joining an online dating app or something like that I got married at 23 and now I'm 39 and I'm dating again. And so that's to me, you know, so it's thinking through, and I'm very much, and I'm in a community of friends, but I'm very much the personal is political and the political is personal. And so I study these things and I think through my own personal choices, and all of these things kind of go in the same thread. And so finding other academics who are working through their own trauma and finding a good therapist, finding a feminist community, but also being able to teach about it. I also Facebook kind of openly about these things, and I blog about them, and I write about them hopefully professionally in the future. And so it's thinking about how healing has to take place both personally, but also there's a feminist fight that has to keep on. And so building community to me is one of the most critical pieces to this.
Great, thank you. And I have a lot of other questions, but I want to open it up to the audience in case you all have questions first.
Hello?
How like Nixon had them like investigated and like, you know, they like sent spies to like spy on the feminists. They're like, oh, these you know, these people aren't doing anything wrong, and he would send spies back just to like make sure that things were okay. But yeah, they talk about like all like the different layers of what like feminists that, you know, that like have pushed for progression, and you know, the history of like all the pioneers, and you know, our bodies ourselves, that book that got published and has made a significant change and difference in, you know, up and coming generations, and how it's still like we're still pushing for like, you know, organic contraceptives, and you know, understanding how to like have control and govern our bodies, you know, as people and humans. And I was just wondering, and it's going to be on Netflix soon, so it's well on its way. Yeah.
Thanks for the recommendation.
I just wanted to know your thoughts about the oversexualization, denial of humanity and pleasure, and gosh, I can't even say that anymore. The ostracizing of white women and trans women of color. Yeah.
So my Dom is right there. Hi, Mike. And he told me I'm an exhibitionist. Y.E.Torres also agrees. And so one of the things I realized very recently was that I use my body and really my looks to make a living. I'm a dancer, I am a performer, and I model. So I oversexualize myself and I exploit myself for a living. And I'm okay with that. It's what I like to do. So kind of naturally, and also because I'm lifestyle, there's no separation between my work and my day-to-day life. I'm full-time is how I like to say it. And so it's a very interesting balance, exploiting myself for a living. And what I do is provide pleasure visually, or by teaching someone to use their body. In a way, the fact that I'm a burlesque dancer, so technically I'm a stripper. And so I oversexualize, my work is oversexualized. So it's an interesting balance because it's what I do, and so I try not to judge others, you know, and just hope that everyone is a good person. And again, I'm a pansexual woman, so when I see a human being, I don't think about them as a gender per se, I just think about them as a person. And I find that in the dance classes that I've taught, I have people of all gender orientations that enjoy coming to my class because of the fact that I don't judge them based on what I think their gender may or may not be. So I'll have people that identify as trans, people who identify as drag queens, people who identify as women. And so I just feel like overall, in my experience, I just try to make a grand open community. And I understand that kind of outside my immediate community, sometimes I have to be safer or more aware of the fact that people aren't as quote unquote open-minded as me. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
I think the word oversexualized is such a relative term, though. I mean, you have to take it within a cultural context, because I think it's interesting that you even use that word to describe yourself, because maybe what you do is sexualized, but why does it have to be oversexualized? What does that mean?
Sorry for interrupting. I think it's partially because as a visual artist, I'm doing that because it's visually, like whether it's in the drawings that I create, and so there's an over-sexualization that may be, you know, considered a metaphor or something else, but that because I am also doing character work and a caricature of myself, that there is an over-sexualization of it.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I think, you know, especially cross-culturally, if you look at a country like Iran, a woman is considered over-sexualized if her hijab is a little too far back, whereas over here, a woman is considered over-sexualized for a completely different reason. So it is just a very relative term. And to kind of stick with the, I guess, difference between Iran and the United States, and sorry, I already mentioned that, I think it's interesting in that country that sex reassignment surgery is accepted, and it's no big deal. Being gay or lesbian isn't okay, but sex reassignment surgery, not a problem. Whereas over here, there's still a lot of stigma around that. So all of these, cultural contexts, I think, are just interesting to think about when you're taking a look at this kind of language.
Absolutely, and I think a conversation, like you said, over sexualization for women a lot of times is just any type of comment or desire that is public or presented. And it's like, oh, this is super sexy and racy anytime that a woman just kind of centers her pleasure and says that this is something that she wants. I think what's interesting when we talk about trans people, I was actually on a panel last week that was a conversation on intersectionality in the Black Lives Matter movement, and one of the panelists is a trans woman. And one of the things that she talked about was this dynamic of going from being a man and the power that she received or that she was privileged with as a man, and then transitioning into not only a woman but a trans woman, and like how much of that power was stripped away and how little she was prepared for like that move, that sort of giving away of power or being denied power. And I think that before we can even have conversations about like trans lives, which is definitely a conversation that we need to have, particularly when we're talking about trans people of color, because the rate that trans people of color are being murdered in the United States, it's like horrific. It's something that's terrible, and I think that before we can even begin talking about trans lives and this idea that we still have it in our minds, like you said in Iran, this is like not a big deal, but here we still kind of struggle with the humanity of trans people, seeing them as human beings and recognizing the difference between sexuality and gender, and ideas about gender that are physical and what lives in the brain and all of that. Like first we have to be able to kind of have a conversation about this sort of hetero cisgender conversation about like pleasure and all of that before we can even begin to conceptualize like what that means when we're talking about trans people. It's a very important conversation, but I think that, definitely feminism and these moves to create space for women to ask for pleasure has also created space for others to ask for pleasure and have conversations about pleasure.
I was just going to mention something really quickly to build on this point, and it's a little bit of a plug for women in gender studies, but a couple years ago, I moved to Houston from a job at Sonoma State University, and Sonoma State's a COPLAC. It's the Council on Public Liberal Arts Colleges, so it's a state university, but with a liberal arts model. And one of my students, an undergrad, she was a dual major between sociology and women and gender studies, and she did research that was looking at, in California, the debate around ethnic studies and required ethnic studies classes, that you couldn't get a college degree without taking some sort of ethnic studies class. And she's like, well, yeah, that's great, and she totally agreed with that, but why do they not have to take a gender class? And so, I said, well, great question. I think that everyone everywhere should take a gender class, and we should start teaching, sociology of gender in, I don't know, middle school. And so, right along the side of, sex education, but I'm one of these crazy feminist liberals. And so she did a study, and so she interviewed, they were short interviews, so it was this combination between a survey and like an interview. So they were 10-minute interviews with probably about 60 students, freshman year through senior year, variety of majors, around, have you taken a gender class? What did you think about these things before? And so half of her sample had taken a gender class, half had not, freshmen through seniors. And guess what? when people take gender classes, they are more accepting of egalitarianism, feminism, trans. They understand sexuality better. They understand gender roles better. They understand pay inequality better. They understand why we need parental leave for men and women. They understand da-da-da-da-da. And so the list goes on and on and on. And so that's one of those things where I just wear the dorky professor hat, because I'm like, why are we not requiring these classes of middle schoolers, but much less college students? We come to a college or university, and we need everyone experiences gender in their lives, and we need to be aware of that, and how it plays with pleasure, how it plays in relationships, how it plays in the classroom, how it plays in the work world, how it plays in politics, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know this is one of those preaching to the choir moments, but that's also, you know, as we think about women and pleasure, and as we talk about these things, it starts, well, I'm a teacher, it starts in the classroom. It starts with us having these discussions with our students, with our communities, and not just understanding diversity, but like deep acceptance of it, and understanding how diversity in a whole bunch of different ways makes us all stronger.
So I just wanted to touch on how we're talking about shame, how society places a certain level of shame upon women. We were talking about this earlier. I was raised in a Muslim household. I'm not a Muslim anymore, but I think it's really important to note that you know, the conversation that we're having right now, and you know, the society that we're talking about right now is vastly different from the society, you know, in the Middle East and countries like Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that really bothered me as I was growing up was, you know, there's this idea of a woman having to cover herself, wear a hijab, wear a niqab, a burqa, et cetera, et cetera. And when I'd come to a point in my life where I could comprehend, you know, or at least ask my mom the question of why do women need to do that? Why is that a thing? The answer that she had for me was that essentially a reason women do this is so that they're not temptress to men, which doesn't seem to make any sense to me, because I'm wondering, why is this burden placed on women for, you know, men to not, you know, like, is it really that hard to have some level of self-control? And I think that this, you know, it's extremely more detrimental in countries in the Middle East, but it also pours into the culture within the United States as well, because then you have things like rape culture and how a woman, you know, is asking to be raped if she's wearing skimpy shorts or something like that. And so I think that, you know, there's a serious level of patriarchy that we need to acknowledge and challenge, that, you know, is detrimental in different terms, whether it's, you know, in within the culture, within the confines of the culture in the United States, or whether it's in the confines of, you know, in a tribal village in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my question is, like, how do we, like, challenge that? You know, how do we challenge that level of patriarchy, and how do we kind of solve it, deal with it?
We need a man like you on the panel.
That's what I was about to say. That's a great question, and I think that one of the things that I always tell people, whether I'm talking about race or feminism and gender, it's like, you know, if that's a problem that the women on this panel could solve, it would have already been solved, right? It is the responsibility of men. For instance, earlier I was talking about the case of the woman who was murdered in Pittsburgh. And so I wrote this article where I said it's time for men to have conversations about this kind of brutal, toxic masculinity that is leading to a man feeling that a woman cannot say no to her without him assaulting her or revenge raping her or murdering her. You know, and it's kind of, and as I remember posting on Facebook as I was writing this, it's like, I'm really tired of begging men to stop abusing women, raping women, to respect women and their choices, and so forth. So I think that you're on the right track in speaking up and having the conversation that you're having, and trying to figure out how to create more spaces where men have those kinds of conversations, where they address this kind of toxic masculinity that creates the patriarchal society that we live in. Because if it's something that we could do, generations of women who have been working towards, pushing back against patriarchy, I think the problem would have already been solved. It takes men being involved, and not only in their personal lives and making personal decisions, but also holding all of the men in their lives accountable to do the same thing.
So I'm interested in the labels that has run through the panel, and the one label that jumped out at me was the word exhibitionist. And so my question to you is, or my comment, is as a visual artist, you exhibit your work on a wall, and that's accepted. Whereas a dancer, your work is an exhibit, but when you exhibit your work in your expression of your personhood, which comes out through dancing, it's exhibitionist. So I'm interested in asking the question, what do you mean by that label? Because once we are understanding we're all on the same page in the meaning of the label, then we can go to the next discussion.
So first of all, I identify as an artist, and right now, my work frames around fire and belly dancing. Everything I do is a drawing, and when I became completely performative in my work, I felt that I was now drawing in space. I did a lecture at the Menil Collection where I had to talk about Jasper Johns. And Jasper Johns was one of the first artists to inspire me when I was 16 years old, and I was very inspired by his mixed media work. So I went from combining my visual art and my dance for the first time in performance installations, where I would take a gallery and create my background within the wall space through the drawings, and then would activate it with performance. So now the mixed media became a performance installation in real time. And then I didn't want to draw anymore with paper and pens and markers and paint, and all I wanted to do was draw in space. Now I do that with fire. And so when I think about the idea of being an exhibitionist, I think about what I have been over the years shamed about, or what I've been made to feel made me feel less, I suppose, and that is the fact that I deliberately show off my body. I have been modeling nude for like 22 years. I prefer to be naked when I perform. And within my own dance form as a belly dancer, that's pretty scandalous. And so I feel that I put on an exhibition of my body as my work. And that, I think, sort of by definition, is being my own exhibition, in which case I've used the word exhibitionist. Does that help?
Yes, I think that the interpretation of the word exhibitionist can be either as you've described it, which is exactly right for you, but it can be a derogatory term.
I like that version too.
So talk about that.
So when people meet me and they say that I'm famous, I say, actually, I'm infamous. And some of the ways that I've described my work is that I am a festive exhibition of deviance and sweetness. My favorite now is that I am an experienced connoisseur of violent delights. I am a masochist, and I have no problem saying that out loud. And so I also have always been inspired by the exploiters in movies and at the turn of the 50s to 60s, when all of the like roughies and black and whites and all of the the first time as women's body and nudity has been allowed, as it more and more is allowed now. And so I also feel that my dance form, Bellydance, came from the World's Fair, or arrived in the United States at the World's Fair, and then it went on to the sideshow and vaudeville. And so there was the exhibitions, right? The shows, the showings of the muscle dancers and the oddities and such. So I just always felt that coming from like my line of history of movement in art, coming from the carny lifestyle where you're putting your own body on, I'm naughty and nice, and I just kind of live it full time. That's the best way I can say. I'm an exhibitionist.
I mean, can I comment on that as well? I think that
Go
the
for it.
derogatory definition you're talking about is, if you think of the pathological definition of exhibitionist, it's someone who is exposing themselves without the other person's knowledge. What she's describing is all mutual consent. So when there's mutual consent, mutual pleasure, it's healthy. If you're exposing yourself without consent, then that becomes unhealthy.
One more question. So my question is, what advice would you give a woman of daughters, of young children who go through the pleasure and the vulnerability and it's joyful, how to preserve that in our society, which still has these, shaming and confining methods of viewing them already. And I find myself as a mother, you've already spoken of your mothers, falling into these traps. And it's like, that's not exactly what I want her to think, but I do want her to be protected. So what do I do with beautiful young girls who are joyful in their pleasure?
I think one of the best things you can do is teach them how to set healthy boundaries. I mean, if you're letting your daughters have art time, you're not going to let them color all over the walls, because that would be disrespectful to the house that they live in. You're going to, have a little area in which they can hopefully, play and color and express themselves in a healthy way, but with boundaries. And so I think teaching that across all spectrums is really key.
So I found myself in a sex dancer after school. She loves playing with boys, girls, doesn't matter. But I found myself telling her, stop jumping on the wood. And I found myself going into this realm of like, you're a young girl, and then I didn't know where I was going with this. So
Yeah. I have a 10-year-old, and so I go, a 10-year-old daughter, and I go through this same thing because I don't want to be my mother in the ways that she shamed me. I developed very early, and like I said, I was still playing with dolls, and it wasn't that she was responding with disgust to me or my growing body. She was responding to the lust that she would see and what she knew about men and what her experiences were growing up. And it was, I have forgiven my mother, and now I understand that she was trying to protect me, but she did not have the language to tell me what was happening, to tell me, your body's growing and it's beautiful, but there are people in the world who will want to do harm to your body. And so we need to have those kinds of conversations. But your body is beautiful. We didn't have, that was the dynamic or the part of the conversation that was missing. And so with my own 10-year-old daughter, who is my child, she is just like me. She prefers to be naked if she can, or wearing as little clothes as possible. And she looks at herself in the mirror, and she has to have all of these lotions and perfumes, and she's my child. And I love looking at her and looking at her little 10-year-old body growing, and how she has her mirror time, and how she gets dressed and looks at herself with joy and with appreciation. And I want to encourage that as much as I can, But she is getting to the age where her body is beginning to develop, because when my body was developing at 10, 11, 12 years old, now it's like even younger, you know? All of these studies are out saying how, you know, children who are developing earlier, getting their menses earlier for girls and all of these things. So I'm still trying to figure out how to have the conversation with her of, listen, I want you to be safe out in this world. But I still need to have that conversation of value and beauty and all of those things with her as well. Because I think if you can combine the conversations, then it can be impactful, and then they will have a better understanding. My mother didn't know how to have the conversation of, you know, it's okay to look at your body, and it's okay to like it, and it's beautiful. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the way that possibly other people look at our bodies and figure out a way to keep ourselves safe. And this is how you do that. This is, like you said, this is how you set boundaries. This is how, this is what you need to look for when you are out in public spaces to keep yourself safe.
And don't be afraid to talk to your children about masturbation. It's something that most kids, you know, start doing. Most girls start, you know, touching themselves, kind of realizing, oh, that felt good. Oftentimes before they even go through puberty, but once having gone through puberty and getting their periods, they kind of become, you know, more aware of that part of their body, and normalizing that, and teach them that it's okay to make themselves feel good. Teach them that while their bodies may feel ready for something, that sometimes their minds and their hearts aren't quite ready, and how to negotiate that gap, I think, is really important conversations to have, you know, early on.
And let me give you a personal example. So my daughter discovered porn on the internet, on her tablet. One day I go into her room and I'm picking up her tablet, and she was like scrambling for it, and I'm like, what is going on? So immediately I go to the history to see what she's looking at. And you know, pornography is so available now. Like, it is just like, you could literally look up a princess and porn will pop up. Like, they have cartoon pornography that's available now. And this was when she was probably about 8 years old. And so my immediate response was to shame her. And I did, first. And then I thought about all of this, you know, feminist training and all of this information that I had, and I had to come back and rehab that conversation with her. Like, so, you know, what you saw in these videos, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what sex is. And then I even found myself trying to figure out, like, writing notes and an outline, even when I was discussing sex, because I'm like, you know, sex is something that happens between two people who love each other. And I was like, but that's not true necessarily. You know what I mean? Sex is something that happens between two people who consent to it. And, you know, it was like all of this kind of, but then she's 8, so I'm like, am I ready to have a conversation with her about consent? But I had to, like, take my time and talk to her, and also listen to what she had to say in response, and apologize to her for the way that I had shamed her, which I think is one of the things that I never experienced as a child. My parents never apologized for anything, ever. And that's one of the things that I have, you know, decided that I want my child to be a full human being. And in order to do that, I need to let her know that people have to be responsible when they make mistakes. And, you know, part of that was apologizing to her, but, like, going back and trying to have that conversation as best I could, and interacting with her, not just speaking at her, but allowing her to speak back with me, to tell me what she was feeling and what she was thinking.
We have time for one more question.
I was just interested in terms of some of those sorts of axes of influence on role relationships that you've brought up in terms of gender and race, patriarchy, shaming, and particularly in the context of, say, how those play out in the heterosexual relationships. I realize it's still a contested terrain, but if we look at the sort of broader possibility of gay marriages, do you see that sort of in the frame of gay marriages, that there is any sort of possibility for redeeming, refining, mitigating some of those influences on pleasure and possibility, or in effect are all of those being sort of brought in and it being expressed in another context, but in effect the problems remain, or is there some hope or change?
I think that from my experience, and I am still learning quite a bit about queer relationships and how gender roles play out in them. I recently saw a film called The Same Difference, and it's a film that was made by a black woman that discussed black women who are, and these sort of ideas of gender roles within the lesbian community specifically. Things that they dealt with were an AG or an aggressive or a masculine presenting, maybe lesbian who experienced pregnancy, and how the shame and like the threats and all of these things that came as a result of that, because there are these ideas about gender and gender roles, and if you present masculinely and you play this masculine role, then you aren't allowed to have these moments of womanhood. And through watching the documentary and talking to my friends, in the queer community about like these ideas of gender roles, it's like they are trying to recreate these very toxic kind of sometimes traditional gender identities and gender roles within their relationships. Do I think that there's hope? I think that there definitely is. When I talk to young queer folk, like just overall, young people are so fluid about everything. I teach 18 and 19-year-olds, and that's one thing that I enjoy so much about teaching is they aren't committed to anything. As far as relationships, as far as gender identities, as far as traditional gender roles or ideas about gender, they're much more fluid than rigid. And so I think that there definitely is hope in the future, and I think that what we have done through feminism and through these kinds of conversations have enlightened parents who are now parenting in a different way that allows that kind of fluidity. So I think it's definitely something that is growing, and we'll be seeing changes soon.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and thank you for the audience and the Friends of Women's Studies. And we hope that you'll also continue the conversation and have some food right outside.